your thoughts, your seats, your drinks, your snacks. I see David is still at the table, which is his happy place. So we'll just wait for him to come back from the refreshment. Good. So thank you all. As you can see, I have a problem. But I've managed to collate the questions into kind of similar lumps. And it's intriguing because actually there's quite a few that fall into a few common spaces. And then there's a few that are unusual, and we may not get to all of them. So please forgive me if we don't get to your question. So I think the first set, which is probably of most, is one of the more popular sets, is one which is a set of questions which talk about the fact that that you were consumed by hatred, you had bitterness in your heart, that became manifest in your family. And clearly that must have changed somehow at becoming a Christian. Could you speak a little bit about that?
If we don't get through all the questions and somebody has asked a burning question, I'll stay behind afterwards and chat to people on one-to-one. But yes, I'll take a few moments to answer this one if it's okay. Where did all the hate and the bitterness go? Should have mentioned that, see, the night I became a Christian, when I got down on my knees in the cell, H block 7 of the Maze prison, repented of my sin, all that hate, all that bitterness, all that anger, all that rage, it went like that. It went as quickly as that, okay? Now, I wrote out to family and friends, told them about the change that had come into my life, and sort of cut a long story short. See, after my dad was killed, my mum stopped singing. I remember her going around the house singing as a little boy as she cleaned. But after my dad was killed, she said she didn't have to sing about it. So I wrote out and told my family about this change that had come into my life. And my mum wrote me a letter saying, how could I talk about a God of love and a God of forgiveness? Where was this God of love and God of forgiveness the night my dad was gone down in the street like a dog? And, you know, her life was full of hate also. And I wrote out a letter based in Romans 12:19. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. Explaining that part of my problem, my family's problem, was that we thought vengeance belonged to us. But, you know, vengeance belongs to God. And I sent a covering letter to my younger sister who was professing faith. I said to her, look, get my mum, take her to church with you, which she did. And that was around about February 81. I got a letter from my mum, and this is how she opened it. I know what you mean about God's forgiveness. Tonight at church I became a Christian. And so when I saw my mum saved, I saw a mountain of hatred and bitterness also moved. And when she became a Christian, she started singing again. And you see, God puts the song back into the life. My mum's 95 today. She's still singing. And so that hate which enveloped the family, you know, God removed that for those of us who became Christians. My younger brother still full of hate. My sister still full of hate. That's my older sister still full of hate, and my older brother. But they have seen the change in my life, my mum's life, and my younger sister's life. That is visible, it's tangible. It's God who takes away the hate through that relationship with Jesus Christ.
Thanks, Billy. And then there are some follow-up questions which are related to that, to do with reconciliation specifically, and a few to do with others in the UVF who saw you become a Christian and then knew you for 5 years as a believer. So just, can you speak a little bit generally about, did you ever meet up with those men who killed your father? Did you meet up with others? How did reconciliation happen? How was that experienced in the prison?
Yeah, you know, reconciliation, restitution, etc. are big questions, are a big part of Christianity. I never ever met folks that murdered my dad. They never reached out to myself or our family. But I can honestly say that after I became a Christian, and to this day, there is no hatred or bitterness in my heart towards those folks. You know, it would be hypocritical of me to sit here and say, you know, God has forgiven me all my sin, but I still harbor hatred for these folks that, brought about all the pain within my own family situation. Because God tells us to forgive our enemies. So there is no hatred or bitterness in my heart towards those folks in the IRA. And I've never made contact with the family of the man that I was arrested for murdering. It did come up in conversation when a number of us became Christians about reaching out to the victims, and every statutory body advises against it. I mean by that, welfare bodies, governors, prison governors, everybody right across the board say don't even go down that road. And there's a degree of wisdom in that, because, like, what was I going to say to the family of the man I murdered? I'm a Christian. My life's all rosy now. I've got my life together. God's forgiven me, and I'm sorry for what I've done. Sorry doesn't even come close to compensate for taking a life. If I ever had received a letter from one of the gunmen that murdered my dad saying sorry would be very, very trite. Sorry would never compensate for the pain and the hurt. So I think it's different if the family reach out. The family of the victim reach out, want to make reconciliation. But for the perpetrator of the crime to initiate that reconciliation, it causes untold damage. So it does.
Thank you, Barry. On a slightly lighter note, there are two young men in the church who seem to have a common interest in how on earth you got out of prison. I think they envisage a breakout, or did you serve your time? Why did they let? When and how did you get out? Could you speak a little bit?
That's a
bit
good
about
question.
the release process.
I served a relatively short space of time for the seriousness of the crime that I was involved in. And I can honestly say, if I was still in prison today, justice would still be being done. I didn't deserve mercy. I didn't show mercy. I didn't deserve it. I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful that the prison gates were open for me. How did it come about? Well, like it or lump it, there are pressure groups in society that are always sort of saying, we should look at prisoner sentences in a more lenient light. And that was the same in Northern Ireland. There were pressure groups who were saying that because of the volume of young prisoners in the prison system, that their sentences should be looked at in a more lenient light because they were used by more sinister men. Now, I can honestly sit here and say, nobody twisted my arm up my back and forced me to go out with a gun and kill somebody. I can honestly sit here and say that I didn't feel that I was being manipulated or pressurized to do anything. I'm not saying it never happens, but in my case, I don't think that was the case. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly what I was being involved in. But people argued that people from my type of background, their sentences should be looked at in a more lenient light. Ken McGuinness, MP for Manor South Tyrone, used my case in the House of Commons to argue that very case. You can read it in Hansard. Used the case of Billy McCurrie, whose father was shot dead by the IRA in 1970 and went out and joined the UVF as a result of what had happened. And you can't blame these young people for doing what they did on the basis of what had happened in their lives. That was the argument. So that argument won the day. And I was among one of the first batch of young prisoners released in 1985.
Thank you. The last question, I'll read it out to you as it is, but I think there is something behind it to do with forgiveness and how that's experienced amongst others, which is perhaps related to the question you asked. So here's what the question is, and forgive me if we misunderstand this. The Pope is a man who had people murdered in his, sorry, the Pope is a man who had people in his care murdered in Argentina. He was forgiven. But many Catholics will not forgive me.
Right. So if I follow the question rightly, and forgive me if I don't follow it rightly, we could talk about it afterwards. The whole question of forgiveness. Are you saying that a person, how can you forgive someone who has wronged you? Is that what the question is?
I think so.
Right. I think only, it's only a work of grace in a person's heart that can cause a person to truly forgive. And there are people who have suffered greatly at the hands of people, and in fact, I have it in my car. I forgot to leave it. I forgot to bring it tonight. I've got half a dozen little books with me, or a dozen books with me, called Making Sense of Forgiveness. I'll leave them with you, and you can bring them to church, and you can give them to folks, maybe the person that's asked the question. And it's a book that has a number of testimonies of people who have been affected in various ways and how they've learned to work through that question of forgiveness. And one of the testimonies is of Rachel Dell Hollander, the Olympic athlete who gave an impact statement at the trial of her abuser, and how that she forgives him for what he did. Now, I think sometimes that the problem is with forgiveness. People think forgiveness means justification. It doesn't. So if I say I forgive the men who murdered my dad, I'm not saying that their actions were justified. They're all probably dead now. It was 53 years ago. But if any of those men had ever been arrested, I would have expected them to be brought before the courts and to, have the full force of justice meted out on them, because their actions were not justified. So forgiveness does not mean justification. You can forgive somebody for doing something to you. That does not mean that their actions were justified, and they're still accountable for those actions. And that's what comes out in this little book, Making Sense of Forgiveness, which might help some folks. So I'll leave those with you, and you can bring them to church, and folks can grab it.
Billy, you've been very forthright and honest, and clearly going back tonight and on other occasions into the past you've had is not an easy experience. We hope you have a good night's sleep.
Thank you.
We hope it doesn't disturb you. But we thank you so much for everything you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if many of you recall or may have seen it, but there was a movie a while ago called Along Came a Spider with Morgan Freeman in it. And Morgan Freeman was plagued with guilt in the film over something he had done months before. And his wife says to him one day, it's been 8 months, it's time you forgave yourself. And Freeman turns to her and he says, Vicky, you know that forgiving yourself is the one thing a person cannot do. I think we've heard a very powerful testimony as to the truth of that, in that the peace that Billy experienced happened after he realized he'd been forgiven and he was reconciled. And we now know from what they've said, I don't need to repeat it, that that's found only in Christ. If you'd like to know more about that, please feel free to chat and come and speak to Billy or to myself or to John. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to have you visit us Sunday morning. As it often happens, providentially, not by my planning at all, on Sunday we're looking at forgiveness and reconciliation between a slave and his slave master. whom he is sent back to by the Apostle Paul, of all people. So you can imagine how difficult that will have been. But that's what we're looking at on Sunday, so it's a further exploration of the topic. It'll be wonderful to see some of you, and thank you so much for coming out and being with us. Thank you all. Please stay around. There's still some more refreshments, and Billy will be here as long as you need him. Thank you. I forgot to say there's a wonderful lady by the name of Angela and others who are in her team. Angela is married to John, who provide the refreshments for us. What you've had is but a mere inadequate sampling of what we have every Sunday after the service. So, thanks to them, also to David for arranging all of this, as well as to those who assisted as well. Thank you so much.